Good evening, everyone. It's a wonderful pleasure for me as the chaplain to greet you all this evening for the annual Brooke Anderson Lecture, and to take a moment just to remind you it is the habit of both the Department of Religion and the Office of the Chaplains who share this endowment to always take a moment to remember the memorial lecture that this is. Brooke Anderson was the last executive director of an organization that ceased to exist on the Brown campus in 1958. The organization was known as the Christian Association, and when I'm asked to explain what that was about, I often say that it would remind you, I think, of the modern day YMCA or YWCA. It was meant to be a fraternal organization. Remember, in those years, Brown was all men. And it was meant to be a place where people would gather in Fonts House, because that building was built to be a place for the social interaction of Christian men. That always makes me smile. And Brooke Anderson was quite an unusual director of the organization in the sense that he had served in the military in World War I, and on the battlefield became a pacifist. He was able to move over from his military service to be part of the Medic Corps, and Brown University currently holds a scholarship that we use to undergird the studies of medical students in his name, that his daughter, Bobby Huntington, the late Bobby Huntington, set up in her role at Harvard in the development office, where she began to get a clear idea of what the legacy was that she wanted to leave in her father's name, this lecture, and the scholarship that is continued in the medical school. We lost Bobby a few years ago, and in losing her, frankly, lost a dear friend and a wonderful protagonist of conversation about religion, conversation at the intersection of peace making and social ethics, and it was with those goals in mind that this memorial lecture was established. To say that I can hardly think of anybody better prepared to give the Brooke Anderson Lecture than my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Professor David Carrasco, is really to sort of understate all of what I've just said. David is the Neil Rudenstine Professor of the Study of Latin American and Mexican American, and is a Mexican American historian of religions with a particular interest in Mesoamerican cities as symbols and the Mexican American borderlands. His studies have taken him into the histories to work with historians of religion, and if you were out at the University of Chicago recently, you would have been part of an absolutely magnificent celebration of his work. His books are amazing, and they often come with CDs so that you can actually listen to the music or see illustrated from film examples of a work that really in some ways is more ethnography than religion, but more religion than ethnography. It's a bit of anthropology. It's one of those ways of approaching study that I would say is uniquely Brown. We don't love our departments and our departmental boundaries, and it feels to me like here we often collect people that stray to the edges and then begin to weave together disciplines as they speak to one another. David is not only a scholar who weaves together disciplines, but he's a scholar who weaves together people across borders of their intellectual prowess and their absolutely ordinary existence on the planet. His interest in being at the borders of our intellectual endeavors and at the borders of human justice are a very important part of why he seemed to me to be an ideal person to come and give this lecture this evening. As you can see from his title, I hope that you are reaching down to your side at the moment for your seatbelt, because it seems to me there's a lot that we are going to be treated to in the journey this evening. But I want to conclude my introductory remarks by saying that as I have on occasion, and only so far on occasion, been David's student, I have always come away not only smarter, but literally changed. Changed in the things I can see, changed in the things I was looking right at and didn't see, and now I'm seeing connections between. So I trust that tonight, in addition to the magnificent intellectual journey will go on with David. I expect that as we speak afterward and as we talk in questions, we'll find that we're actually talking from some different place than we used to live. So I hope you're ready for a wonderful journey to the borders of your thought, and with the competent leadership of a marvelous pilot and a remarkable scholar. David, it's a privilege to welcome you.
Thank you.
Have fun with the good audience.
So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I want to say this is my third event here at Brown today. So I had a chance this morning to have lunch with a group of students who had just returned from the U.S.-Mexican border, and made a presentation on what they learned and how they got involved in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And we had a terrific exchange. This afternoon I also had a chance to have what's called a tea, which ended up to be a great circle of presentations by students on their own lineages, the names of their families, their grandmothers, and presentations on the different kinds of languages that were spoken in their family homes. And I think at the end of that conversation with those student presentations, I think that they had a very different understanding not only of the people in the room, students who they'd known, but without ever knowing their grandmother's names or where they were from or the kind of languages that were spoken in those homes, but also themselves. At least I felt that there were some moments that were really, to use a overworked word today, awesome. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to say that it's good to be here at Brown. I've been here several times before. It's good to be reunited with several colleagues. Kay Warren is here, was a colleague of mine at Harvard. As I told her a little bit earlier, I'm glad she finally made a step up and came to Brown. Kay Warren's done such important work in Latin American studies, not only in terms of the anthropology of Guatemala, but the ways in which Guatemalan peoples themselves and other Mayan peoples are developing new understandings of their commonalities and differences. So it's wonderful to see Kay Warren again. It's great to be here also with David Kim from Connecticut College. David is a person whose own critical thinking about American letters and certain types of psychological and emotional forces in American letters is revitalizing the way many of us are thinking about words, dance, invitation, friendships. And so it's great to see him here as well. I also want to say I'm very glad to travel down here with my wife, Maria Luisa Parra, who teaches at Harvard, and she and I are teaching a course this semester that I'll be referring to. It's a first-time course at Harvard called Latinos Remaking America, Immigration, Culture, and Language. And so that, as well as all of these names I've mentioned, including my visits today with students, have enriched my time here already. And so I want to certainly thank Janet Cooper-Nelson and the Office of the Chaplains and Religious Life, Department of Religious Studies, and I see some other colleagues here who are with me at Harvard, for this opportunity to speak with you about something that means a great deal to me and which I've thought about a long time. And as I present this notion of the Latino springtime, that we're in a Latino springtime, I want to use sort of two methods. I want to use what Michael Jackson at Harvard calls existential anthropology. That is, I'm going to tell you some stories from my own life and how I've become engaged with these issues from my childhood till now. Because I think sometimes telling the stories of our own lives as they have been involved with the so-called people we study, our resources, our informants, it's very important to acknowledge that kind of involvement and approach. But I also want to speak to you as a historian of religions, trained in the University of Chicago tradition, in the Chicago School, with a certain interest in religious experience and the way religious experience shapes our lives and our communities, and also my interest in sacred places and sacred spaces. So these are kind of the background that I'm bringing to this presentation on Latino Springtime and the New Democracy, with the subtitle of Deep Heritage, Disruptions, and Choices of Hope. And my own approach to this also comes out of a certain type of family history in schools. I descend from several generations of school teachers and also artists, but school teachers who who developed their own approach to learning in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands. What I learned from my grandparents and my parents was that education in schools was not only about the acquisition of new knowledge in order to develop new credentials, but in our family it always also had to do with expressions of social justice, trying to find places, whether it was a playground or a classroom, where we could come to think that there was a level playing ground. That's always the way that schooling was transmitted to me. And I want to talk a little bit about that and show you some examples so that you can understand where I'm coming from when I talk about this notion of Latino springtime. One of the forces in my background that's important to me was my abuelo, my grandfather Miguel, who in the 1920s built a school on this location. This is the American Smelting and Refining Company in El Paso. And you see El Paso here, and you can also see Mexico in the background. And on this place where millions of tons of ore was smelted, he set up a school for Mexicans, just for Mexican people, Mexican boys and Mexican girls, to try to train them in the trades, the different trades. But the school always also had this idea that schooling itself not only had to do with the acquisition of these skills, but it also had to do with a certain way of participating in the democracy that they were joining. And also the idea was that this was a way in which we could participate in a way to not only revitalize the democracy, but also a way to contribute in some way to social justice. I know this is the case because this school, which ended in the 60s, established in the 1970s, they built a memorial to that school on this, at this smelter. And they put a time capsule in that memorial. And that time capsule just last year was accidentally recovered when they decided to destroy the smelting company itself. They didn't know that there was a time capsule, and when the time capsule popped up, they took it over to the the local history museum, and they uncovered it, and there was a statement about what the school meant to the Mexicans, and what my grandfather meant to these Mexicans, and it was clear that this was about, even though they were learning the trades, it was clear that this was about a holistic approach to learning. A way that was not only about being able to get a job, but it was a way to be a citizen. And so that was transmitted to me as a young boy, because it came through my own father, who himself, I'll talk about later, but he built the first Job Corps Center in El Paso, and it eventually became the David Carrasco Job Corps Center. And in the Mexican tradition, and especially the Chicano tradition, there's a mural about his life here, which stands on Route 10 as you go into El Paso. And it also reflects this idea that education has to do not only with climbing that ladder, but it has to do with the revitalization of the very society that you learn in. And this is a part of what I bring to the presentation tonight. But the person who probably had the most to do with my approach was my grandmother. Here you see my grandmother, Carlota Carranza Carrasco. She was born in the Copper Canyon in Chihuahua, at the bottom of the Copper Canyon in a town called Bato Pilas. When she was 12 years old, she came out on a mule train. She was, as we say in Spanish, muy prieta. She was a very dark skin. She was part Tarahumara. Here you see her. And she helped raise me. When we were young, all the grandchildren were very impressed with the beauty of her skin. And we used to talk to her about her skin. How could this old part Indian, Mexican woman have this kind of skin? And she used to say, well, I have a secret ingredient. And we used to say, well, what's the secret ingredient? And she said, oh, my secret ingredient, and she kind of whispered it to us. And she said, my secret ingredient for my skin is prayer, 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 and good cosmetics, she said. She said it was really this combination of prayer, 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 and good cosmetics. And I tell that story more than just to connect with the audience, but to let you know that my approach to what I'm talking about has to do with this combination that my grandmother taught me. On the one hand, what I learned from this was that, and she was she herself was an evangelical Christian, not in the way you talk about evangelicals now, just that she was a Christian who came from the heart and she wanted to constantly, but it was really about a theme of balance and complexity that comes with the challenge of this Latino springtime, between that part of us, the balance between that part of us that leans toward prayer, tradition, devotion, to connecting with others and with an other, and that part of us that leans toward cosmetics, meaning technology and science, or what I call the social cosmos we live in and are reshaping, because it seems to me that we Mexican and Mexican Americans are remaking America through the skillful use of our bodies, our work, our families, our imagination, and the ordeal of immigration. And this combination, this is the way I translated it later, that it was on the one hand a sense of the religious devotions that people carry with them, not only to their gods and to their saints, but to each other, to their families, to their language, to their food. Because it seems to me what connects people often to their culture is a deeper river of devotion that she expresses here. But also, of course, it was important for me to, to learn the kind of interpretive approaches that I needed to make. And so that's the kind of combination that I like to share with my students and bring with me, because it seems to me that I want to use this combination of awe and respect for tradition and the embrace of new technologies to reflect on our own social cosmology, the dynamic social world of a deep Latino heritage and choices of hope. So the key question for me, something I share in my discussions with David Kim and Maria Luisa Parra, is how can this new demography lead to a renewed democracy? And it seems to me that universities like Brown and Harvard are the right places to work on that question. So I begin this exploration of the question of how our new demography can contribute to a new democracy with what is called, and many of you in the room will understand this phrase, the signs of the times. A phrase that urges us to be alert to how signs, often unexpected signs and symbols in nature and society, point to new ways our society is changing, and sometimes rapidly. Being able to read the signs of the times, the signs of our Latino springtime, well, it used to be the responsibility of a biblical prophet or a seer or a poet or an astronomer to decipher the signs of the times around us. But now all of us have to realize we have the ability to look around at our local world and read and interpret the signs of our Latino springtime. What's the first sign I see? Well, the first sign is the decisive role played by Latinos, and especially Mexican-American voters in Obama's election. One headline read, "Latino voters help sweep Obama's re-election." Some polls claim 71% of the Latino vote go for Obama. And we know that the Democrats and others are frightened now because a recent poll showed that many Latino voters are being turned off by some of the things in the Obama administration and thinking, well, maybe we're not going to vote so much for that side of the ticket. So this election sort of woke people up to the signs of the times of just how powerful and how significant the Latino population is going to be. But polls also showed that the Latino electorate thinks more broadly and in more complex ways than the media has led us to believe. And while immigration reform is high on the list, Latino voters were concerned about their families, their security, their jobs, and the economy. There you see, Estamos Unidos, Latinos for Obama. Well, you wouldn't necessarily see that so strongly today, and that's going to be important in the future. The second sign, of course, is that the Latino demography is now at 50.5 million, or 16.5% of the population. And between 2000 and 2010, the Hispanic population grew by 43%, which was 4 times the growth of the total population at 10%. Among Latinos, the Mexican origin population increased by 54% and had the largest numeric change, 11.2 million, growing from 20.6 million in 2000 to 31.8 million in 2010. Now, this is important to say. I'm not trying to diminish in any way the contributions that Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Salvadorians and so forth are making. It's very important. But the reason that all of those communities are also important and powerful in the voting is because of the size of the Mexican population. It's that big number that allows the entire Latino group to become very significant in this. And here you just see the percentage change in the Latino population between 2000 and 2009. In those sort of yellow states, you have a 75% more increase. In the green states, a 60 to 75% increase during that period of time. In the others, it's less than 60%. But you're getting a sense here of a surge, and that's very important, whether we like it or not. The third sign, of course, is Spanish itself. The spread of Spanish practices in college. Today, I don't know how it is here at Brown, but Spanish is the most popular language by a huge margin in college curriculums. The Modern Language Association reports that 865,000 students are taking Spanish courses. The number of students taking classes in all other languages is over 100,000 less. 37 million Latinos over the age of 5 speak Spanish at home, and 50% of those 37 million speak English very well. And we had in our conversation this afternoon with students, first it started out English, but then all of a sudden Yiddish shows up, Spanish shows up, different kinds of Spanish shows up in the family homes of students here at Brown. And we got a very rich sense of the diversity of these languages as time went on. And here you see the second most prevalent language in each US state. So what you have here, this is French, here is German, and all the rest is Spanish. So you have here this very powerful sign of the time, it seems to me. Of course, sign number 4 is the whole question of religion and the way in which the Latino presences, ideas, practices are beginning to impact the way in which religion itself is practiced in the United States. Here we see our man, Francis. Is he a Latino pope? It's up in the air, but it certainly seems that the kind of theology and some of the attitudes that he is showing, people are beginning to associate with liberation theology in some fashion. That's a very interesting comeback, because those of us working in Latin America know how powerful the put down of Latin America, of liberation theology has been. And so here we have this, but it's not just Catholicism. We also have the Pentecostales. One of the things that happened when the previous Pope went to Cuba, some years ago, they thought it was going to be this great victory for Catholicism. And what happened was Santeria came to the surface so powerfully that it started to push Catholicism off the front page. So there's this great diversity and great surge of these religious practices. For me, sign number 5 happens to do with sports. A recent headline read, "Is Major League Baseball too Hispanic?" 28% of Major League players are Latino, and 42% of the minor leaguers are Latino. In a recent book called Race Ball, How the Major Leagues Colonized the Black and Latin Game, we see that, quote, "the best cohort of talent in the game today, Latinos, won half of the Silver Slugger Awards given to the top offensive player at each position in the American and National Leagues in 2010 and 2011, and routinely dominate all-star lineup shows." It shows you just how far-reaching this is. Now, this is important. You can watch television, you can watch baseball on television all summer, and you will not know that there's all kind of Spanish being spoken on the field. I mean, you can watch all summer baseball, and you will not know that these people are talking Spanish all the time on the field, because unless you're watching Spanish television, but it's being spoken all the time on the field. One of the things that really bothered me, because I grew up thinking Ted Williams was cool, was that when they tried to put together the Latino Baseball Hall of Fame, it came out that Latino was Ted Williams, Latino Ted Williams. Ted Williams' mother was Mexican. I don't mean Mexican-American, I mean she was Mexican. And all his life he hid the fact. Not only did he hide the fact, he was repulsed by the fact that his mother was a Mexican. He avoided his Mexican family in public. When they came to the park, he stayed away, the Splendid Splinter. Said, "I can't handle the fact that my mother was a Mexican." And this is really interesting to me, to show you how how much things have changed. So when they came to figure out who was going to be in the Latino Baseball Hall of Fame, they said, well, should we put Ted in? No, don't put Ted in, man. They didn't be in the other Hall of Fame. That's all right. Sign number 6. My story is America, says presidential inaugural poet Richard Blanco when he read his poem One Today. He's the 5th inaugural poet, he's the first Latino, he's the first immigrant, the first gay, and the youngest poet to ever read an inauguration of a US president. The sign is that Latino artists of all kinds are being recognized, that they too sing America, if in Spanish, Spanglish, and a variety of languages. We also have, as parts of this literary expression, we have these wonderful writers coming forth. Juno Diaz. This week we were just teaching Juno Diaz in our class up at Harvard. And the students, they love Juno Diaz. A lot of them don't understand Juno Diaz, but they love him. They love his play of language. They love that critical stuff. They love that self-reflective thing, the way he's presenting a kind of Dominican Spanglish as not only giving people access into his novel, but he's also saying, as Professor Parra taught us, he's also saying, I'm presenting this Spanglish as a gate that you have to pass through. I'm not just talking the Spanish in a real easy way so you can just get in. You're going to have to struggle with this Dominican Spanish, which itself is quite complex and wonderful. You have people like him. You have Sandra Cisneros. You have a number of other writers themselves who are starting to get this kind of attention. In spite of the Kennedy Center's near exclusion of Latino artists from its award, only 2 of 170 awardees identify as Latinos, Placido Domingo and Chita Rivera, until recently. You have people like Gustavo Adolfo Dudamel Ramirez. Is the Venezuelan conductor and violinist. He's the musical director of the Orquestra Sinfónica Simón Bolívar and the Los Angeles Philharmonic. This is very important, it seems to me. Another sign, of course, is Mexican food. Here's a book, Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America. But I really like the fact that Calvin Trilling in the New Yorker did an article called Tamales on the Delta, a culinary festival in the world capital. And he says, I doubt if many people think that the hot tamale alone can bring Greenville, Mississippi back to its glory days. But every little bit helps, you know? Every little bit helps. And it's a marvelous analysis of what's going on in the Mississippi Delta, the fact that these tamales were brought to this area in 1900 by Mexican workers. And they've now been picked up and changed and enriched by local folks. I mean, if you go there, you want to see a sign of the times, or you can go to Doris's Hot Tamales, where there's delicious hot tamales, homemade hot tamales. Or you can go to Heavenly Hot Tamales here, where the brother has got his little thing. And so this whole thing is taking place in ways that are not only tasty, but they may be signs of the times. And of course, then you have something like a Latina justice, Supreme Court of the United States, invigorated by a wise Latino woman like Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, whose best-selling book is called My Beloved World. Now here she could have come and said, you know, man, this was a world that was put down. This was a world that was colonized. This was a world that had all these disadvantages. And she comes and she calls it My Beloved World. Oops. She calls it My Beloved World. I'll get to it. Oops. This thing is reversed. There you go. She calls it My Beloved World. And so these are some of the, many of you will see signs of the times of the Latino springtime differently than me, but I just wanted to show you some examples of things that are right on the surface. Some of the moves in our new demography, maybe toward a new democracy, so that we can participate more fully, more effectively. Secondly, I want to talk about this notion of deep heritage. And here I really wanted to speak especially to the students and the good students who came to hear me today and to have me hear them. Because when you talk about a heritage, there's a kind of word that doesn't have much play in academia anymore. People don't use a word like heritage too much. It's not postmodern enough sounding, you see? It doesn't have, but I like heritage, and I like the notion of deep heritage. Because heritage means to inherit. A gift of a portion of a land or a language or a culture. It's a gift to a new generation that comes about when someone has passed away or something is passing away. It often involves ancestral bones and ashes, which are a resource for both honoring tradition and stimulating innovation. And what I want to do is just tell you the story of how I came to know about the deep heritage of myself and Mexican people. I like this particular image because what you see here is a field worker, and he's struggling with that short hoe. That short hoe is a controversial thing, a controversial object, because the short hoe is what these workers were forced to do, forced to use, and therefore they had to bend over more. And during the civil rights movement among these workers, that's one of the things they protested, was the use of this short hoe. So here you see this man bent over, what I call history bent over in the fields. But it's imagined that right below that surface you see another kind of heritage. And this came to me in what I call my Aztec moment. You've heard of the senior moment, where you forget something. Well, let me tell you about my Aztec moment where I remembered something. I was at a medical conference in Mexico. All Mexican-American doctors and nurses. And I was having dinner one evening with a group of them. And one of the women said, I have an Aztec moment once a week. Everybody kind of looked and said, well, yeah, well, what do you mean? So, well, you know, I have one of these moments where I realize that I'm not white or I'm black. I'm not white or I'm not black. I'm a mestizo, I'm mixed. And in that mixture, I know, she said, that I have a relationship with indigeneity, with the indigeneity of Mexico. She said, you know, when we go to Mexico and see our grandparents and families, we see that indigenous in them. Or we see the food having an indigenous meaning. We go to parks and we see these indigenous names. We even hear some of these indigenous languages, words in our families. And she says, so I realize every week that I have an Aztec moment. And everybody said, you know, that's true. We all started telling us. And I told them about my first Aztec moment. I was 13 years old. I was living in Mexico City. My father had been invited by the Confederación Deportiva Mexicana to help train Mexican coaches in preparation for the Olympic Games. My father was from the U.S.-Mexican border, and he spoke very good Spanish. He used to play for the national Mexican basketball team, and he was a celebrated coach in this country. And so he was taken to Mexico City, and he was teaching Mexicans how to coach in preparation for the Olympics. And I was 13 years old, and my aunt, Milena Soforo, lived in Mexico, and she took me for the first time down to the Zocalo, the great Zocalo of Mexico. You see the church and the governmental building. But right down this street, Kay will tell you that down in Moneda Street is where the National Museum used to be. This was the National Museum of Anthropology. It wasn't yet over in the Chapultepec Park. How many of you have ever been to Mexico City? Great. How many of you have been to the National Museum, had a chance to go to the National Museum? It's a fantastic place. Well, it used to be right here in the central space of Mexico. And I went there, and I went into that museum, and I started walking around, and I saw these fabulous things, man. I saw the Aztec calendar stone. This incredible thing. I saw jade masks, came from the Maya. I saw these masks, you know, it came from Teotihuacan. I saw these images of deities. I saw pictorial manuscripts. I saw this incredible array of civilization and culture. And as a result of that, I began to have a kind of a paradoxical nervous breakdown. Because on the one hand, when I saw this, I became aware immediately that what surfaced in me was all this shame that I had been educated to have about my Mexican background in this country. All this sense of degradation, that Mexicans were good for jokes, and they were good for jokes about Moctezuma's revenge or the halls of Moctezuma, some Mexican food, some kinds of trinkets, a little bit of serape, some of this kind of color in terms of the way in which the media was presented Mexicans. And yet, here I was, and I began to realize, man, I've been told to deny this. That if you wanted to study culture and civilization in this country, you studied the Greeks, you studied the Romans, you studied the Egyptians, maybe the Chinese, but you didn't study Mexicans and Guatemalans in terms of their civilization, in terms of their complex societies. And so on the one hand, I was feeling this kind of shame, but what also came to me as I walked around and then went out into the Zocalo and began to see this tremendous space, I began to develop a great curiosity about this deeper heritage, you know, what it meant. And I realized it was something here not only to be proud about, it was something to be studied, something to be understood, something to be known, and that it was just as important perhaps to know about this deep heritage while I was also studying the Romans and the Greeks and getting access to those Latin traditions, that this was also very important. And this Aztec moment, it wasn't that I was an Aztec, but that I had access in my own lineage to this type of rich complexity, as well as all the things that the Spaniards brought. And this was something that really stuck with me. So I began to look at this and realize that right in this very place, as a matter of fact, these buildings are right on top of these particular buildings, and I've been involved in the excavation of these buildings for the last 30 years because that Aztec moment stuck with me. And so this sense of deeper heritage is one of the things I want to say to students in terms of looking back at these ancestors like we did today. You might find yourself getting access to, why? Why should you do this? I'm not saying just do it because you're Latino or Chinese or whatever it is. If you're at a place like Brown or Harvard and you're a historian, what you're supposed to do is, well, know human history, wherever you can find that human history. And here's a human history. Now, if you just want to know the Greeks and the Romans, that's okay. But if you want to know human history, include these in your humans. This is what came to me in that particular situation. I carried it with me to the University of Chicago. I became not only a scholar, but an activist. I was involved in Casa Aslan here, down on 18th Street in Chicago. And I helped them take over this building. I was an activist. We took this over from the Presbyterian Church and turned it into a Mexican-American cultural center so people could get not only learn Spanish and English, but they could also get job training and so forth and so on. Same time I was doing that here. But what the big lesson that came to me at the University of Chicago that took me back to that Aztec moment came from a man named Paul Wheatley. Now, Paul Wheatley was the chairman of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and he was bad. He was bad. He was really something. Paul Wheatley could read every primary language from England to China. He could read all of those languages, and he wrote a book called The Pivot of the Four Quarters, Preliminary Inquiry into the Origins and Nature of the Chinese City. And what he did is he did a comparative analysis in the 7 areas where it could be argued that primary urban generation took place. It was northern China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. What am I missing? The southwestern Nigeria was a debatable case, the highlands of Peru and central Mexico. And he said in every one of these areas, you basically had civilization growing out of monumental ceremonial centers. But what he said to me was, Mexico, where I had my Aztec moment, my deep heritage, that was one of the places in human history where human beings came together to cooperate, to compete, to invent, to develop long-distance training, long-distance trading, to develop cosmologies, to develop this kind of architecture that led to the creation of what we call civilization. And Mexico was one of the places where you could go to learn not just about Mexicans, but about how human beings developed complex civilizations where social stratification became the basis for the rise of these types of urban traditions. So this really stuck with me, and it was a big point, linking my 13-year-old Aztec moment to what I was getting in school, just like you're trying to link what you did in your childhood to what you got in school. Now this came back to me, this deep sense of heritage came back to me later when, through some very good luck, a friend of David Rockefeller came to Harvard and announced to us that she had come into contact, and into not only contact, she had come to acquire one of the lost great codices of Mexico, the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan. And she wanted to know if anybody at Harvard could read it. Now, the thing about this that's kind of strange is that this thing disappeared from a museum in the 1970s, and we all knew it had disappeared. And all of a sudden, this woman shows up at Harvard and says, I own it. I'm a friend of David's, and I'll give people money if they can study it. So they came to me and we looked at it and we began to see, I began to see, given this background that I'm talking to you about, coming from the US-Mexican border, being involved in an Aztec moment, working in Mexico City, I looked at this map and I could see that in this map that was painted in the 1540s by indigenous painters who were undergoing colonialism and narrated their Iliad and their Odyssey right here on this map. It has 700 glyphs. What they did, they presented their great history without a single Spaniard being there, although there's 2 Catholic churches, and here's one of them. So they were saying, we're already into Catholicism, but we also are telling you that our great story that includes a moment of Catholicism is really much deeper in terms of our heritage. And what I saw in this was an ancient pattern of what goes on with many contemporary migrations. First of all, there was a great place of origin. And if you were a Mexican American like me growing up in this country in the 1960s and 70s involved in the Chicano movement, you knew that the great place of origin was called Aztlan. And here was the best painting of Aztlan that had ever been uncovered. If you go and you take a look at UCLA today, you will find that the #1 social scientific journal on Mexican American studies comes out of UCLA. It's called Aztlan. Them, without even knowing that this existed, they're trying to identify with this deeper heritage. Well, here was Aztlan, a place of origin that migrants then leave and go on a great journey to a city. They have hardships on this map. They have all kinds of things that take place. That's for another talk. But they come then to a great city like Los Angeles or Tucson or Chicago or now Boston or even Providence, because those cities are what draw. See, I always think that diaspora studies are incomplete unless they talk about the place people leave and the place they're going to. And this map showed me that an ancient pattern of these migrants was right here. They go to the city, they not only go to the city, they get involved in all kinds of cultural exchanges. They have weddings. They have battles. They fall into the underworld. This is a great story of the hardships that migrants follow, including the arrival at an opening to heaven. There's an opening to heaven in this particular document. Their religion was here. And the more we looked at it, at this close-up, in terms of this deeper heritage, what you have here is a kind of womb-like origin place, painted in the 1540s, probably a copy, Kay will like this, of a pre-Columbian document, where ancestors themselves are flying out, coming out of this place of origin, and they're all carrying sacred bundles on their back. They're all carrying sacred bundles. And one of the things that's so powerful about this particular document is that there's 14 sacred bundles on this document. In terms of the ethnography that was done in the 16th century, where Spanish priests were interviewing elders to find out about what their religion was, they produced a 12-volume work called the Florentine Codex. There's only one time in the 12 volumes that they mention a sacred bundle, because they're too dangerous for the Spaniards to know about, because they're going to burn them. And here were all kinds of sacred bundles in here, showing you how people move their culture. But they're led here by this very powerful woman. Very powerful woman. This is Janet. This is like Janet, man. She's leading them out. She's leading them out of this particular place. See, but what really impressed me about this when we looked at this powerful woman is that this is a meeting of two different cultural groups. At the beginning of this great story of the emergence from caves going to the city and a great migration where they're taking their culture. And right here at the beginning, you have a statement of the need of bilingualism. Because these people can't speak the language of these people. And therefore they needed a translator who was bilingual. I like this. Because here in this ancient document, this ancient story, people are already bilingual. People didn't become bilingual because the Mexicans came here. They were bilingual long before the Mexicans came here. Bilingualism, trilingualism, this is the nature of human society, this was saying to me. And it was very, very impressive. I like this particular image. I like to tell this story because about the time we were studying this, this is Itzpapalotl, obsidian butterfly, who's coming out of the origin. She's got the leg of a male deity who she's defeated in a battle. She has these different arrows in her. This is my deep heritage. See, and I was going to do it. About this time, we had a president at Harvard. You may remember. He was going around getting all kind of trouble, and then he came and said, well, you know, women have this kind of innate inability to do science and math. And finally, people at Harvard had had enough, and they said, no, man, we're voting you out. So I decided I was going to send this to him as a Christmas card and say, look, man, this is what happens when you deal with women this way. You're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. See, this is a deep heritage. Another thing that was impressing me about this deep heritage is if you go to Mexico today, you go to Mexican communities, you see that the deep heritage itself is not just indigenous. It has to do with the encounters between the Spaniards, the Africans, and the Mexicans, the indigenous people, including something like the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is a great, long, other kind of story. And here you see my man has had her tattooed on his back because she's got his back. You see, and what they're doing is they're taking this moment of great meeting that the Catholic Church wants to impose, but the people themselves are saying, we're going to make of it something that you don't know we're going to make of it. You also have the Day of the Dead as part of this deep heritage of the meeting of indigenous people, and also the Catholic notion of All Saints' Day. This is an altar that's been built at Harvard University, and every day now at Harvard, you've got to bring you back 600 people come on Day of the Dead. It's the biggest event in all the Harvard museums. And most of them that come are not Latinos, because they want to participate in the color, in the feeling of this particular kind of sacred bundle that has come all the way and been changed all along the way to Harvard. And maybe we have to do something like that at Brown. In terms of this deep cultural heritage, students consider the fact of all these Nobel Prize winners that come out of Latin America in a short period of time. Gabriela Mistral from Chile won the prize, the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947, in part for her Cartas de Amor y Desamore, and for exploring how Latin American identity is formed from the mixture of Indian and European influences. In 1966, Miguel Ángel Asturias from Guatemala won the prize in part for his Hombres de Maíz, which illuminated the magical world of indigenous religion. Called the greatest poet of the 20th century in any language, Pablo Neruda from Chile won the prize in 1971 in recognition of his epic Canto General. Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude hit the literary world of Latin America and then the world like an earthquake in 1982. Writing about Garcia Marquez in the New York Times, William Kennedy remarked, 100 Years of Solitude is the first piece of literature since the book of Genesis that should be required reading for the entire human race. It takes up not long after Genesis left off and carries us through the air age. You do well to pay more attention to the cultural renovations of the Latin American and Latino boom, the religious dimensions of this. The Mexican poet and essayist Octavio Paz won the Nobel Prize in 1990 in part for The Labyrinth of Solitude, in which the national character of Mexico is cast in a rich narrative about the interactions of Aztec, Catholic, European, and African peoples. The African borderlands is highlighted in Derek Walcott's 1992 prize, in part for his epic Omeros. Throughout his work, Walcott has explored how his identity is rooted in a fusion of African, Asian, and European stories, struggles, and meanings. We can also mention the borderland writings of Carlos Fuentes, Isabel Allende, Jorge Luis Borges of Argentina, Jose Martí of Cuba, and Nélida Piñón of Brazil. Students, I mention these names and prizes to make 2 points to you. First, to emphasize the deep narratives of engagement with the cultural and racial borderlands in Latin American identities. These novels and poems show us the diversity within Latin American borderlands, where European and indigenous and African languages and religious practices engage with one another. Part of what we learn is that the culture and religions are very different in Chile from what they are in Guatemala, remarkably diverse in Colombia in ways that seem worlds away from the mixtures found in Mexico and Brazil. But students, my second point in invoking these Nobel Prize winners is that the crux of their achievements, just like the crux of your achievements, is the creation of new narrative languages written from within the various cultural borderlands, entangled histories and border crossings between the epistemologies and theologies of Europe, Africa, Latin America, and in some cases, Asia. We have people like Esther Hernandez, this Chicana poet. She's trying to reimagine America by taking, oh my God, this is going to bother some people, the Statue of Liberty, and showing this woman carving it into a Maya stele. She's showing, and what does she call it? Aztlán. That's the place, the cave of origins that you saw back there in the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan, or Santa Barraza, who's reimagining the conquest in this way. Here she is herself, Malinche, giving birth to the first mestizo, and Cortez is seen back here as this kind of almost convict-like character, showing her as the suffering mother, but the creative mother who's associated with these plants, with this indigenous world, and so forth. But three, let's talk about the disruptions in my title. I like to show this because my friend Carlos Fuentes passed away last year, and here you see him in front of this calendar stone. And when you see him in front of the calendar stone, you see the size of this calendar stone. You see the beauty of this calendar. You see the monumentality of this. You see the cultural, the civilizational qualities of this calendar stone. And he had this great phrase. In Latin America, you have to imagine the past and remember the future. And what he's doing is he's reversing the way we usually say it, where you remember the past and imagine the future. He said, no, in Latin America, you got to imagine the past. Why? Because what happened was this whole colonial history that came along, it destroyed these documents. Do you know that of the thousands of indigenous pictorial manuscripts that were painted and extant when the Spaniards came in 1517 and 1518 and 1519, only 15 have survived, and half of them are in Europe, because all the rest of them were burned. You see, that's why it's so valuable to find that map that we found and being able to interpret, because it brings back this tradition and so forth. And he says you have to imagine the past, because this past itself was so wounded and was so degraded. It's one of the things that Pablo Neruda talks about in his Nobel Prize literature. He said, we are carrying with us the destroyed past of these people, and we have to do what we can to try to imagine it, find in our imaginations, their imaginations, by looking at the fragments and the bits and pieces, and also the ways they're carried on by people today who've been able to carry this deep culture with them. I like this, especially for the students. He said, we must then see ourselves in the world as unfinished projects, as perpetually incomplete personalities, as voices that have not said their last word. To do so, we must constantly articulate a tradition and constantly push forward to possibilities of being men and women who are in history, but also make history. Who are in history, but also make history. And that you have to see ourselves as people of great potential, as unfinished projects, not people who are just trying to imitate and make your way into the projects that Harvard and Brown present you. As I told the students today at Harvard, I always tell my students, you were somebody before you came to Harvard. And you better remember that you were somebody before you came to Harvard, because if you go out of here thinking that Harvard has made you who you are a completely colonized Harvard person. And Harvard may remake you, Brown may remake you, but they're remaking what you have brought there. You were already created. And it's very important to see that. And I think that's one of the most important things in terms of my discovery of this Aztec moment, that there's all these heritages. If I just want to be a historian and be a good historian and look at the history, well, then let's include these people, because if you want to be a historian, then look at the history. Don't just look at the history. I like this piece. It's a history of disruptions. I like this piece by George Yepes. It's called Boxcar. And George Yepes painted this for a playbill. And it shows this young immigrant who comes across. He's looking strong, he's looking intense. He's here passing over the Rio Grande, the Rio Bravo. The Rio Bravo, here he is. But here he is again. He realizes he's not crossing over the Rio Bravo. He's been trapped in a boxcar. And he's not looking over the Rio Bravo, he's looking through the slats of the boxcar. Because this playbill was for a play about those 18 men who were found baked to death in the desert. And then here you see him as the Dia de los Muertos, the same man. This is part of these terrible disruptions that you also have here. One of the things that I have found the hardest to get across to students, when we have this language of people crossing borders all the time, and all of this money spent on trying to stop people from crossing the borders, is to look at the fact that during this short period of time, here was the original U.S., so-called original U.S. territories. And in 50 years, they went all the way over here, crossing every border they could get across, claiming all this territory. I mean, you want to talk about crossing borders that the borders immigrate. Take a look, just think in 50 years, that's well within my lifetime. They've gone all the way from the Ohio Valley to California, taking this big part of Mexico. So these disruptions in culture are really fascinating and interesting to look at, especially when you take a look at the extent of the viceroyalty of New Spain in the 18th century. This was all New Spain here. All of this yellow was New Spain, explored, claimed, messed over, and so forth. So in terms of these border crossers, let me tell you who the champion border crossers are. The champion border crossers happen to do with the U.S. government. John Coatsworth at Harvard did a study, and in the 20th century alone, 41 times, every 18 months, the United States was involved in a regime change in Latin America. So you want to know why these people are here? Well, they're going to tell you, we're here because you were there. And you were there with your guns, and you were there with your money, and you were there with your technology, and you were there. We kind of knew about you, but we really came to know about you because you were involved in regime change in all of these places. Now that's an awful lot of border crossing. Now that doesn't mean that simplifies the border crossings now, but if we're going to be historical about it, let's also remember that during the 20th century, there was this whole program to bring these braceros into the United States by the millions. And here's the point that we have to face up to. If we want to be socio-historically accurate, these people were brought, they were recruited, they were brought here, they were supported, they were paid. They went back and forth, they formed relationships, they had families, they came to know, they told people there about how to do it, they were welcomed. This is a part of our shared history. This is a part of this history of disruption. And it leads us then to what's most important, and I'll do this quickly, the choices of hope. Now, I had a chance while I was at Princeton to work closely with Toni Morrison. As a matter of fact, I took Toni Morrison to Mexico on several occasions to meet people there. And I really like, in terms of these choices of hope, which is what you students have. You have these choices of hope. She says, these chapters put forth an argument for extending the study of American literature into what I hope will be a wider landscape. I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography and use that map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration as did the original charting of the New World, without the mandate for conquest, she says. And it seems to me this is really what the spirit of Brown can be for you. This kind of new geography, this new intellectual, sociological, linguistic, scientific geography, a critical geography. It opens up a map for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration. When I show this slide, people think I made a mistake. No, I didn't make a mistake. I put it this way on purpose because I'm trying to show you, in terms of this critical map, when people want to talk about these borders, when you put it this way, all of a sudden you see things differently. You see how close Cuba is to Florida and to Mexico and to Louisiana and to Texas. You realize that people did not move from east to west. They moved in all kinds of directions, diagonals, north and south, in circles and so forth. And so if you want to, in a sense, understand the need for this Latino springtime, is it comes out of this type of history, and we have to have new ways of looking at the maps that we're going. I like the fact that that actually came from this Chicano artist. Here he is presenting his view of Mexico and the greater Southwest Florida, North Carolina, and so forth. He's got a lowrider here. And he's trying to make it fun because this is a little conjunto where all the women, all the Latinos have dyed their hair white. I mean, I dyed their hair blondes, you see. But it's the same kind of notion. In terms of new ways of seeing things, here's a moment that I can tell you I had a role in. I see myself as a border crosser because I took Toni Morrison to Mexico. I'm the one who introduced her to Garcia Marquez, who took the greatest Latin American novelist and put her in the same room with the greatest American novelist, with my handsome friend Carlos Fuentes in the middle. And you can tell if you look at it that Garcia Marquez looks like he's in love, and he's got a Hindu god coming out of his head, and so forth. But here you see this moment of this kind of new critical geography taking place, and I'm proud to say, yeah, I had a hand in this. And I had a hand in this because of all this story I'm trying to tell you. Okay? Because Toni Morrison, she trusted me to take her across these borders, to meet these writers. And they became quite good friends, the two of them, Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison. Garcia Marquez at that time would not come to the United States because of the United States' attitude toward Cuba. But as a result of this, he did come to the United States, and he came to Princeton and spent a week there with us. And as a matter of fact, I was Toni Morrison's assistant in teaching the course in which Garcia Marquez came. That's border crossing. That's the choice of hope right there that I'm trying to tell you. And let me just tell you, we'll sort of end very quickly with a story, and then I'll give you what I think are the 7 or 8 choices of hope. So my father made a choice of hope. My father, who was from the US-Mexican border, and here you see him in the middle. He played with the national Mexican basketball team, Mexican-American. And I like this picture. I like the fact that their arms are locked, this team. He played for this, it's called the Chihuahua Dorados. And my father then went on to become the first Mexican-American basketball coach, head basketball coach at a major university in this country. And I grew up on that campus. And my father helped to bring about a kind of a revolution in basketball. And what happened was when my father arrived in Washington, D.C., here he is, you see him here with the Mexicans. He was training the Mexican coaches. I like this because you see the affection. You see the relationship between them in terms of his border crossing. But he became this coach in Washington, D.C. And when he was in Washington, D.C., when he arrived in there, Georgetown, Maryland, George Washington, American University only allowed white people to play in public sports. And because of his border crossing, and because of this heritage I'm telling you about, because he came from the Segundo Barrio and he understood and he was comfortable with blacks and blacks were comfortable with him, he recruited the first African Americans to play public sports in a college in the nation's capital. And I grew up on that campus. I knew what that was like, and I saw that. And one of the things that impressed me that I want to communicate to the students here, in this case, it was not about following African Americans in the civil rights movement, which was going on. Here was a case where a Mexican American, a Latino, took the lead, recruited African Americans, said, I will stand by you, you will trust me, I will trust you, and created the first integrated team to play public sports in the nation's capital. It was led by a Latino, by a Mexican American who himself grew up knowing what it was to be a border person, because he understood that these African Americans, both of them who became all-Americans and played pro basketball, both of them understood that they needed a border man. They needed somebody who understood boundaries in order to lead them through this. And I'm still friends with these people, and we all talk about this, what this was like to go through this type of transformation, this choice of hope against tremendous prejudice and racism. I mean, we had to fight our way out of some basketball gymnasiums. We had to fight our way out of Georgetown, which today is almost all African American. We were there. So it was a cat from the border who made a choice of hope. And so what I think your choices of hope are, and I really am coming to the end, is first of all, organize with others to do good in the world. You know, at that discussion we had at lunch today, it was a really cool discussion that we had with the students. And I started feeling some pushback by some of the people saying, look, man, we can't, you know, we just can't change it. It's going to be very hard to change it. You can't change this immigration policy. You can't do it. And it is going to be hard. But I'm old enough to remember what it was like to live in segregation in this society. And I saw people saying that all the time to black people. And I heard all kinds I saw all kinds of vicious kinds of barriers going up to black people. And what happened was black people and white people and brown people, a lot of people, they joined together and they did change the policies of the government. They did change the way things, and they did it by organizing. They didn't do it just by, you know, coming up with ideology and all this. They got organizations going. It's changed. There's no question about it. And you can bring about some change. The other thing I would say, fight for everybody. It's not just your group. One of the worst things that happened in the Chicano movement, they used to have this phrase called, mi raza es primero. You know, my people are first. Now, I can understand that. When your people have been last, you're going to say my people are first. But I would say the choice of hope is not to say my people are first. We say my people are part of the struggle for this type of new democracy. And it ought to be that you just fight for everybody who's involved in this, even those who might be against you, like Martin Luther King, who you say you have to try to raise the consciousness and the heart so that they will join, even if they will not join. I think you got to learn this technology. And now I'm preaching to the choir because you know technology better than I do. As a matter of fact, Maria's 14-year-old knows technology better than I do. But you really got to learn this technology and utilize this technology in all these kinds of new ways in order to bring about this change in the democracy through this new demography. I think this is crucial, and I think you've done it. I saw it today. You've got to attract mentors. Go ahead and find these mentors. There's a Zen saying that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. It's also true that when the teacher is ready, the student will appear. So, you know, but you've got some great teachers here at Brown. Get your mentors involved. They want to be involved. You know it because you have them here in the room. But don't put all of it on their shoulders, on Janet's shoulders. Get yourself these other mentors and attract these mentors and utilize these mentors. And cultivate leaders who are going to build coalitions. It's really about coalitions. This is a choice of hope. It's not just about, you know, getting in the newspaper. It's about coalitions that have to be built. And dare to know your own history. Absolutely dare to know your own history. Dare to know. You know, today we had folks, I think, who were really starting to get into their grandparents. Maria Luisa and I have an assignment in our class where we did the same thing. Asked students to go back to 3 generations. Man, they got on the phones for the first time, and they were crying on the phones, mothers and grandfathers, and were starting to tell them stuff that they had never asked, they never cared to know. And they've just revitalized their whole relationship with their academic work at Harvard because they realize that they have arrived there at Brown and Harvard because of the sacrifices, mistakes, creativity of these people. Plan your own economy. If you don't plan your own economy, somebody's going to plan it for you. Somebody's going to plan it for you. Find ways to happiness in the midst of harsh struggles. This is one of the great things about Brown, is you can find your ways to happiness in the midst of harsh struggles. And I think it's really important in the days ahead of your lives where you're going to deal with harsh struggles, with disease and other kinds of things. You got to be like this cat here. He's going to be able to jump these barriers, use this type of ingenuity, this type of dexterity. You've got to be like Cesar Chavez. I like this idea, this image of Cesar Chavez. He's made up of all these other things. He's actually not himself. He's really the connection of all these things. And you look over here, you see all these skeletons in the field. You take a little look up, a little close up at the skeletons in the field, and you realize they're not skeletons in the field, they're families. There's 2 sisters, a mother with 2 children, somebody carrying somebody else. We're all tied up with these kinds of people. This is your deep heritage that you've got to get to know. And I'll just end with one little quick story, and that is some years ago I had this public debate with Samuel Huntington at Harvard. And Sam had written a book called Who Are We? And in this book, Who Are We? He took it upon him to absolutely slam Latinos. And he has one chapter in particular where he basically said, at the top of every list of problems in this country, the Mexicans are there. And at the bottom of every list of achievements, the Mexicans are there. And because he had already written this great book on the civilization, what's that thing called? The Clash of Civilizations. He was now saying the clash of civilizations in the United States is between the Mexicans and the Anglos. And he came and he said, look, let me tell you. So let me tell you. It's not a melting pot. It's not a tossed salad. This culture is a tomato soup. He said it's a European tomato soup. And at the core of this culture is an Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking, Protestant, small family culture. That's the core of this culture. And anything that comes along, whether it's Jewish or Catholic or Latin, that challenges that has to be stopped. That's what the barrier is. That's the border that we have to do. We can let some of these Latinos in, but we can't let them challenge this core. This is a Harvard professor. Can you believe it? I believe it because I teach at Harvard. Yeah, people like this. And I said, Sam, I said, do you know who picks the tomatoes in this country? I said, do you even know where the word tomato comes from? I said, the word tomato is a Nahuatl term. It's an Aztec term. It's tomatl. And the Aztecs used to say that when some man was particularly good looking, he was smooth like a tomato. I said, and you are here talking about how this is a European tomato soup. The tomato came from Peru. It went to Mexico. The Spaniards got it. They took it back. They ended up in England. And in England, they just killed the tomato in terms of while the Italians were celebrating it. I said, so don't tell us that this is about a European tomato soup. I said, the whole thing and the whole future of the culture really has to do with salsa. I said, Sam, so don't do this anymore to me. So that's my sense of how we ought to be thinking about the Latino springtime. I know I've gone on too long. The problem is once I start, it's hard for me to stop. But thank you very much for hanging in there. gone on too long. I'm sorry, man.
Not at all. I can only imagine the range of your thoughts and questions after such a rich talk.
You hope, yeah.
And I'm guessing that maybe we can prevail upon David. He's totally right. We have prevailed upon his patience and his intellect and creativity all day long, beginning with, we did feed him a little bit along
Yes,
the way,
we
but
did.
I'm not
Very
sure we
good,
gave you
very
any
good.
time to eat. So for a few questions, a few comments, a few reflections, I'm going to prevail.
Okay.
Presume
Sure,
that you're willing.
okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes.
Is the salsa a metaphor for the mixture of something? I mean, I love the tomato. It's excellent.
Yeah.
Why bring the salsa, bring some little chiles in there and spice it up a little bit more? You want to build a little more on the metaphor for it?
Sure. What you do, la cocinera, eh? Yeah, so exactly, that was the idea. Well, there's a couple things. Number one, in terms of this idea of migration, what we're arguing is that the migrants themselves, you bring, to go back to the mapa, kind of sacred bundles. And in these bundles, they carry their culture. And then part of the things in the culture that has come is the food. And the foods involves kind of a staple of Mesoamerican foods, where chiles, corn, squashes, other types, and there's so many types of chiles. There's many types of chiles that are cultivated. These have come across, and it absolutely is this kind of mixture of cilantros and different types of chiles, which are. I don't know if you saw a film some years ago called Like Water for Chocolate. Yeah, so like water for chocolate comes from a phrase in Spanish, como agua para chocolate, which means that you cook the chocolate so hot, that it really creates this extra power. And one of the things that's so powerful about that particular film is what happens in the kitchen. Not only in the kitchen, but with some of the things that are made in the kitchen. You remember how it gets into not only to their eyes, but to their romances and to their moods and so forth. And so that's the kind of idea where Sam was saying, what he says is, it's an Anglo-Saxon tomato soup, and you can add a few croutons, but you don't want to put too much in it because it won't be Anglo-Saxon anymore. So I was just trying to say, look, man, if you're going to talk about tomatoes and chiles and stuff like this, stop it. Stop it, Sam, stop it. Yeah. So, and there may be others here who can talk more about the cuisine. So I think this Mexican cuisine, I think it's not only for its color, its taste, its deep heritage that's in it. We're just trying to make this more than just something that's picante, but it's something that's also got sabor. It's really got this new taste, these new kinds of tastes, which are, all these other cultures are bringing. But this is also coming across with these, have come across. And then as Professor Parra, who reminds me, it's important to remember these things were here before the United States became the United States. This parts of the country were Mexico, and they had these things there. So this isn't something that's just migrated. People have migrated to it. That was part of the. Who else? Yes.
Thank you very much. It's extraordinarily rich. I was struck by the emphasis on springtime. I guess I'm thinking of other conversations and conferences lately that have been much more focused on perhaps coming storms or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about what you see as perhaps the importance of optimism or of hope versus a kind of where it's important to not be unrealistically optimistic, and how those maybe realism and hope and how they fit together.
Thank you for that. Yes, I slipped away from the text where at one point I say, in Spanish I say, hey, somebody's saying, hey, chale, hold on, man. You're giving us all this springtime. We're living in an inframundo here. So you're talking about all this sunshine, and we're on the beast, traveling through Mexico on this terrible thing. I didn't tend to emphasize that because it's emphasized a lot, but it shouldn't be left out. You're absolutely right about that. And I think that there is so much. Well, today when we had our meeting, I talked about the distribution of sadness that is so widespread in these Latin cultures, as well as this other kind of upbeat stuff. This is from a book by Carlos Vélez Ibáñez, who talks about the unusual amount of distribution of sadness that you see. He's talking about the southwestern United States, where you have gangs, which is sadness. Poverty is sadness. Unemployment is sadness. Mental illness is sadness. One of the great memoirs written by a Mexican-American writer, John Philip Santos, really focuses on the suicide of his grandfather. He's named after the grandfather, so his whole life has been fascinated by the depression that's in these communities because of these long histories of disruptions and so forth. And I think that's absolutely important, and I don't mean to leave that out, but I got this notion of springtime from Vincent Harding, the African-American historian, who called me up one day. He says, I think you must be in the Chicano springtime here. And he was really talking about what he calls hope, this idea of hope. And the hope that he's talking about is a kind of openness to the potentiality in very tough, awful situations sometimes that you see, I think, in the black spirituals, and you can also see in certain Latin music that is not only critical, but it's what I call politics you can dance to. And I think it's really important to look at the ways in which some of these cultural practices have done just what you're saying. Look at the storms and the storms ahead. And use cultural mirrors and cultural practices, not only to criticize the causes of those, but to try to give people out of their own histories methods of transcending or lifting themselves above it. If I had thought, I could have brought in some music that I think represents that. So yes, thank you for that. Yeah, David Kim.
Well, I mean, that was wonderful, amazing as always. I mean, maybe a question similar to Tal's. I mean, something about deep heritage and this idea of the Aztec moment. Right? I mean, there's a way in which you can reclaim an Aztec moment, reclaim a history, but also heritage can reclaim you. Right? And then there can be terror and darkness in it. Right?
Yeah.
So there are these unknowns in that, and I think surely part of the at best ambivalence about this emerging Latino America
Yeah,
is the ambivalence about what's going to be claimed on America as a whole.
yeah,
I mean, so it's a psychological condition, it's a spiritual condition, right? I mean, so it's not just uplift of we know our history, right? But what do we know when we know our history? And our history lays claim on us.
yeah, yeah. And I think that this history is very troubling. I was thinking of this book on the Comanches that showed this long, awful, historical, violent relationship between the Mexicans and the Comanches, Native Americans in this country. I mean, I think that we have to look at those kinds of things also to see, again, to use that historical question, well, this is who we are. This is who we are. One of the things that happened today in this tea that we had is the students, when they went around and talked about their grandparents and their languages, they were also asked to mention some kind of boundaries or borders they were struggling with here at Brown. And man, it was this incredible list of boundaries and borders that students are dealing with. Some of them have to do academics, some of them are personal, some are generational. But it was, I mean, the thing was so cool because it should have been filmed. It could have been a marvelous play about Brown, not only contemporary Brown, but the lineages out of which Brown students come. And one of the points we came to, kind of related to yours, is that, if you take a look at these boundaries or these borders, and you look at them, as many people will, as alien statements of alienation and statements of conflict, which they can be, but they're also the points of contact. They're also the points of propinquity. And I think that if we look at that propinquity, that contact, and look at the history of that contact, well, we have to go through that too. One of the things that, when I talked with Vincent Harding about this Latino springtime and the way African Americans may feel about it, they may feel very supportive, they may feel suspicious, they may feel displaced. And he said, we're just going to have to go through an awful lot of talking about this and working through this. What's that?
There is a river.
There is a river. There is a river. And that river will hopefully carry us. And I think that's one of the struggles. I think one of the students today talked about, this fact that, Toni Morrison says this too. She said, the great thing about being a writer in the United States is that you have a country that made these great claims for individual freedom. And they did. But at the same time, they enslaved all these people. It's not, like Richard Rodriguez says, that this culture is is only about race, not about freedom. No, it's about both of those. It's been about race, and it has been about freedom. And that's the paradox that's most powerful about it. What I'm trying to do, and I work with Latino students, is to, in a sense, invigorate them to get involved in that. Because, we do have a problem in the Latino community sometimes of being muy callados. First of all, we're very courteous. We sometimes don't want to challenge authorities, or we challenge them crazy, you know. And it's important to develop styles and abilities to speak up effectively about these things. And I think that's one of the things that Professor Pata and I are trying to do. So, you had a question.
Yeah, so kind of going on to that, I think I really appreciated when you were saying, you know, if you want to learn history, you have to learn the history of humanity, you have to learn the history of these great civilizations. And this notion of the Aztec moment, for me, it made me think, like, when was my Aztec moment? And actually, I wanted to push back on what you said, because I think my Aztec moment was when I realized I wasn't Aztec, when I realized I was Zapotec. Mexico, and in the region where my dad comes from, they still, like, the elders still speak, and my dad still speaks the native language Zapotec.
Yeah.
And they have a celebration in November, I believe, where they have a whole week of dancing to the Virgin of Rosario.
Yes.
And their dance is representative of the conquest.
Yes.
So to me, that seems like they're celebrating the conquest, and that kind of, you know, blew my mind the first time I thought of it. And when I kind of like asked my family, my brothers had something to say about it, and they were like, because Zapotecs were some of the groups that were being enslaved, and they were being maltreated by those Aztecs. So yeah, I think the Aztec civilization is one to really study and look at. But on one of the classes I'm taking this semester, we're talking about like generalizations and where we feel comfortable with history and generalizing about a people. So
Yeah.
I think many like Chicano literature is based off of like this Aztlan and Aztec strong civilization, and that has been generalized.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm not sure where I feel comfortable
Yeah.
like leaving behind, say, Zapotec and
Yeah.
Mixteco.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. No, you got it. I mean, my Aztec moment is your Zapotec moment. So you don't have to have an Aztec moment. It's just this moment of realizing this kind of rich complexity. So the Zapotecs are another one of these great civilizations in Mexico that develops also this whole complex kind of bundle of social stratification, long distance trading, and so forth. So you don't have to be an Aztec, but you got your Zapotec moment. And I was also saying, I didn't say it clearly, I'm a child of the conquest. We are child. If you're a Mexican, you're a child of the conquest. But those Aztecs are in there. Those Zapotecs are in there. Those Mayas are in there. And there's, there's so much that we still have to learn about those presences. For instance, we know that all this immigration, we have all kinds of people showing up in Boston who are Maya speakers. They're primarily Maya speakers. That's part of this, that's part of this complex historical reality that historians and other people need to get at. So I like very much what you said. Forget those Aztecs. I'm going to be Zapotec like you, man. And so, I mean, the first time I went to the Templo Mayor, I met this great archaeologist, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma. And he's a Mexican, and many Mexican people who look at people like me who are raised in the north, on the other side of the border, as people who've been drained of their Mexicanness. They call us pochos. But Eduardo Matos was like, hey man, I'm getting all these phone calls from Houston and San Antonio and San Francisco from these Mexican Americans who think that the excavation of the Great Temple has something to do with them, that they live in Aztlan. We Mexicans know that Aztlan was not that far north. But I want to know about these people, he said. I want to know why they are connecting. Can you help me understand that? I call that his Chicano moment. He was trying to find out why is it that people who've never even been to Mexico, never even been to Mexico City, when they heard about the Great Temple excavation, they said, hey man, somos en este linaje. We're part of this lineage. Well, they may or may not be. They may be Apache. But there's something here that's very important to understand. And he was trying to say, man, I, as a Mexican archaeologist, I want to understand these people. So I like that kind of openness about it. And his name is Moctezuma. Yes?
A while ago, I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago, at Brown, I was having lunch with a friend who worked here. And we were talking about the then controversies and debates over immigration. And she's Native American. She said, it was just so few words.
Yeah.
You're all immigrants.
You're all in on
You're all
this.
illegal.
Yeah, you're all in.
She said it with a smile on her face. But then she said, I remember she said, so she said, that's to know the future. And I think part of what she was saying is this influx and this intermingling. So she's part Native American and Black. But this is what has been, and this is what will be. And she was just putting this emphasis on the mix and the intermingling, and
Yes.
the dynamism.
Yeah,
And she said, this to know the future. And
yes.
so I was just curious
That's
about
great,
this
yeah.
expression, because you talked about what it is to imagine the past.
Yeah,
You didn't say as much about to remember the future.
yeah, that's right, I
Is there
did,
a-
yeah.
I mean, what did that phrase?
Well, that means exactly what you said. What he means by that is that we are going to become, members of a new community in the future, that you remember the future. You're going to revitalize the membership of the future. And it's going to come out. That's why he has that passage about the potentialities, unfinished projects. So much has to still be said. And then we have to be against, he said, we have to be against anti-Semitism, anti-Afro-Americanism, anti-Catholicism. We have to get against these because there is all these mixtures. Now, not everybody has all these mixtures, but when you took a look at the students here, presentations today, that was absolutely, I'll use the term a mestizo world. It's not mestizo, but the mixtures that were in the room were just tremendous, including my friend here. Do you know her mixtures? Oh man, it's deep. It's really deep. So, yeah, I think that maybe that is the future. Certainly the President Brown, yeah.
I'm going to ask you to join me again.
Yeah, it's the same thing.